This is a radically human conversation, and today we'll be talking with Dwayne Booth, Mr. Fitch, who's both an artist and a political activist, which in fact is one topic we ought to be able to talk about. So we usually start with a same format, and Frank's going to introduce our major concerns, and maybe you could give us some background as to how you got to where you are today. But go ahead, Frank.
Okay, well, to review, we're going to talk about the fact that our biosphere is endangered, our democracy is endangered, and even our humanity itself is endangered. And we're also suffering this crisis of discourse. In other words, we're not talking about the the genuine issues facing humanity right now, especially our life support system. So, with that in mind, we'd love to hear about your feelings about this crisis of discourse and what we're talking about as a people, what we're failing to talk about as a people. And I know you're going to have lots of opinions about that.
Yeah, so many opinions. I don't even where to start with a question like that. Because I think we're all engaged in this kind of work because there is a shitstorm that is never ending. It has so many different versions or different volumes of distraction inside of it that it turns us all into spectators of bullshit, which prevents us from feeling like we can have deeper discussions. We don't even attempt eloquence anymore. And when you do that, you turn yourself into a reflexive personality that looks like you're panicking just like everybody else. So if what happens is we end up our intellect starts to look like our emotions, which are like we're sinking, we're sinking, we're sinking. We don't even have time to figure out a strategy on how to keep ourselves afloat. Um, that's the perception, but I don't think it's the reality. And I think that forums like this and these kinds of conversations are important because what we're doing right now is we're slowing down the debate. We're slowing down the conversation so we can essentially have a conversation. Because if we can figure out how to build in moments of pause to reflect and demonstrate empathy for other people who we're engaging with, that's the only path forward. And the work that I do as an artist quite often is throwing up a visual monkey wrench into the expectations of people. Um, yes, I try to be provocative. Yes, I try to get people to be surprised quite often. And if you do it correctly, and again, if you build out these moments of pause and these places to reflect and have conversations in, then you can have somebody say, wow, what am I looking at? Or I don't agree with that. Or I agree with that. Let's have a kumbaya moment where we can just have, preaching to the choir. I've often heard people just say, you're only preaching to the choir. And I always say, listen, choirs need practice. Choir practice needs to happen so that we can make some beautiful music and demonstrate, the commonality. Invite other players into this orchestra of humanity that we're trying to demonstrate as something beautiful and not so broken into so many pieces that we can't even stand each other's company.
Nice, nice. Well, one observation that I've heard a few people make about discourse and conversation is that a lot of people now are drifting into this domain of self-censorship and premature obedience to power. And I think you've probably recognized that as well.
It's funny that you say that because I'm actually coming to you right now from my office at the University of Pennsylvania where I've been fired. So as you can see, I'm packing up my things. I have to have everything out by Monday. And that is just the prime example of exactly what you're talking about. All these, particularly the Ivy Leagues, Harvard, of course, has demonstrated some sort of pushback. But by and large, these privileged institutions are just all about, capitulation to power. And they're just sheer demonstrations of cowardice. I've been teaching here for 10, 11 years. And I've had the most popular courses here at Annenberg. I teach at the Annenberg School of Communication. And I had one course that was called Warning Graphic Content, and it was about the history of art as commentary. And the other course that I taught was called Sick and Satired, and it was about the history of satire. So if we're talking about methodologies on how to push back against what is happening right now, you've got satire and you've got art. And if you look at the history of both of those disciplines, you see they've always been at the forefront of challenging. We can't let power draw all the parameters on all the conversations that we're going to have. I mean, I would even see, I just said it out loud, but I would also say that what has been happening in recent times, from my perspective, is we're allowing p politics to determine the narrative that
Mm,
is going to guide our lives. And that's never, ever worked out well,
mhm,
because that's what promotes nationalism and ultimately that's how you stoke and create fascism, which is not being hysterical. That's what we're all facing right now.
mhm,
So in previous decades, previous generations, the only thing that has moved us towards a radical humanitarianism is making sure that the culture is healthy, and that we are the ones who should be determining the conversations that we should be having. And we should be recognizing the fact that we're all vulnerable and that we need to watch out for each other. You don't go to politicians for that. Nobody ever has. In fact, you escape from that line of thinking, which is all, it's quite often the mentality of politics is so anchored in the mentality of good and bad, good and evil, othering people who are different from yourself, right? And everybody knows that that's not true. Everybody knows that when you engage in that kind of political conversation, when you start to vilify other people, there's something in the center of a human being that says that's not right, although it might be a winning strategy and I might gain something from the system. And maybe if I mature later on in life, I'll regret it. But what we do, we go to art, we go to the cultural institutions to remind ourselves that we're human beings, and that what does honest conversation look like, right? I mean, I just came back from Europe and I spent a great deal of time in museums. And I'm always just reminded that looking at these artists, men and women through history, are always questioning what the dominant culture is telling the general culture,
mhm.
challenging what the idea of what the status quo is. And long history of artists getting in trouble. Artists are always, for me, have been a combination between an activist and a philosopher,
mhm.
right? So those are the people who are going to challenge, the dumbing down, the deliberate dumbing down of culture and insisting on willful ignorance. And just what Frank was saying at the beginning about self-censorship. I mean, I'm surrounded by people here at this institution for years who are all about self-censorship. When all the stuff was going on about Gaza and the tearing apart of encampments and so forth like that, I am actually surrounded by decent people in my department, but they feel they're also at the same time being in a privileged institution like this, they're also have to be careerists in their minds.
Mhm.
So they're like, what the strategy moving forward is to let's put our heads down. Somebody actually did this talking to me about it. Let's put our heads down and hope that maybe the midterms will make things better. Or we'll keep our heads down and maybe in 4 years, we'll have a different representative of the corporate duopoly to fix things. And it's such a privileged white position that it just turns my stomach because in the meantime, yes, I'm at an Ivy League institution, but there's real people suffering here and all over the place that don't have the privilege of saying, let's wait 2 years, let's wait 4 years. And that's been my greatest pain working here because I was hired. I'm a college dropout. They hired me because I'm a practicing artist. And when you have a practitioner of a craft like this, the students are thrilled by it because it's not all theory, it's practice,
Mhm.
right? And so I got in a lot of trouble last year because of my stuff on Gaza. the same old, you're an anti-Semite, blood libel, blah, blah. And yeah, it's just like, ad nauseum, as we all know. This is not a genocide. This is not a genocide. Guess what? It is a genocide. And I'm not going to shut myself up. So as a result, they're pushing me out and saying it's for budgetary reasons.
If I recall, you received an email,
Yeah.
firing you. It wasn't like a conference beforehand or anything. Has there
No.
been any discussion between that time and now when you're cleaning your office out that has been relevant to the issue?
No, no. In fact, the people who are in charge, again, that's the heartbreaking part. These are people who I would consider my friends. That's what happens when you teach in any community. You develop friendships. And then when the marching orders are given and that fish is a deterrent to the trustees' mission here to sort of silence voices, which is what has been going on, we have to get him out. So the dean, who was an ally, she refuses. She will not speak to me. She won't answer my emails. So all of the conversations I've been having have been very formalized, practically form letters that have been coming to me, and I can tell that they're written to be, as above board and sort of like this because they refer to me as Mr. Booth in those. And I've been here for 11 years and everybody calls me Fish. You know, so when you start to see, we're going to now assume that all of our emails, all the school emails are being looked at by
Or
the Penn administration and the federal government because the Penn administration has been handing over the emails of faculty and students for the last year and a half, 2 years without subpoenas, to the point where if you work here as a teacher, and many students also got this message, you do not communicate anything on your school emails because you know it's going to be used against you. I mean, students have had their jobs rescinded for actually asking for like a ceasefire and things like that, going to protests, not allowed to walk at graduation and so forth. So the last year and a half, all the conversations that we've been having at Penn as faculty members have been through Signal and like WhatsApp and sort of literally whispered on campus. And it's stuff that growing up that you hear about from, other very dark times in history. You say, wow, that sounds impossible. And it's absolutely normalized. It's absolutely normalized. And just for the last few weeks, I'll come onto campus to get things and meet with former students and so forth. And colleagues will saunter up to me and they'll lean into me and they'll whisper. They'll say, I don't agree with what they're doing to you. It's really unfair what they're doing to you. It's paranoid, it's horrible, and it's a far cry from what I wanted the experience of teaching at a university to be.
Mhm, mhm.
I would imagine that, many of your students are, concerned about what's happened. And you've talked a bit about the role of an artist. How do you see the artist slash commentator or, you know, artist slash cultural icon? What's that balance between, doing what you would consider to be pure art, if in fact there is such a thing as pure art,
Mhm.
and having a role in society, especially if you're say in your early 20s and you love art, you're going to have to think of a career, I
Yeah,
would assume, unless you've got, rich friends or the
yeah,
idea of living in a garret as a poverty-stricken person isn't always possible.
yeah.
How do you talk to people about the balance and if there can be a balance and how they should look at that challenge?
Well, it's a great question because at one time to answer your question about how I talk about it, the students who I've engaged with over these last many years, I show them the history of this form of communication, and I don't treat art in accordance with the artifacts alone, because there's a lot of art history people who look at things and say, "This is art. This is art. This is art." For me, the artwork is the proof of how somebody is thinking and feeling and how they're applying that to something. So it becomes the artifact that it demonstrates how somebody thinks and feels.
Mm.
So just getting back to who an artist is or what an artist is, uh, for me, it's always been somebody who wants to challenge, the predominant notions about truth, aesthetics, all of these things, just because you're a curious person, you know, and you don't have to be able to have that plugged into a specific craft to then say I'm an artist because look, I've created this. Because if you look at even the recent history of the art form, David Shrigley, for example, if you know his work, David Shrigley's artwork is he can barely draw. Yet you see his ideas and you see what he's trying to communicate because he's fearless enough and brave enough to not care about what you think about his craftsmanship. And that's part of the artistic mind. It's being open and trusting of somebody to at least consider what you're trying to communicate. And getting to that to your point about how do you turn that into a vocation or an occupation or something, that's the rub. Uh, Particularly when there's no middle class anymore.
Mhm.
With the destruction of the middle class, it becomes harder and harder for people to follow their hearts and to figure out how they want to manifest in the world. What does that mean? Who am I? Who do I want to appear to other people? Who are other people even? Asking all of those questions. There was a time when an artist could have a crappy job and then spend a great deal of time with these exploratory examinations on who we are, what we are, where we're going, uh, and politicizing that, another way to consider it is if you are not an artist, you don't have to be an artist to understand what I'm about to say. Anybody who's trying to figure out the truth of a situation wants to do it in a private space, right? If you're trying to figure out what you want to say, if you're writing, even an email, right, or something longer, uh, you tend to do it in isolation if you can.
Mm.
When you're in those spaces, it's very hard to bullshit to yourself. You can't even offend yourself with dirty words. If you're sitting in a room and you start swearing to yourself, it's meaningless, right? So all of the things, all the tropes from being in a public space, which tell you that you should be reacting in a specific way, that you should be ashamed of certain things, that you should not even engage in certain kinds of thinking. Like at time of slavery, you would only in private say that black people were not inferior. Same thing with the gay movement. We all have had, there's all different kinds of minorities in our social groups, right? If you knew somebody who was gay, women, you know, anybody who had a mother, a sister, or an aunt knows that that is not the inferior sex, right? But there were penalties for going out and saying that. They deserve to vote. There were penalties. You could be ostracized. The social fabric does not support that kind of humanitarianism. So the artist, by contemplating in these private spaces, you find yourself, wait a minute, that's bullshit. Let's move this out of the way. This is true. This is true. And now I'm going to crystallize what it means to be a human being, a version of a human being. Okay, now I'm going to share that with people. And that's why all through history, it's often like, whoa, people's minds are blown by a lot of the communication and the language that artists use. But it resonates because guess what? They understand it because they feel the same way. They just haven't had the bravery or the experience or the invitation to engage in what the artist is asking them to engage in. So many of the people and the students that I've talked to, they love that because it's giving them permission to feel.
Mhm.
Literally, I mean, that's all it is. That's all while I have a certain ability with craftsmanship, I can draw hyper realistically or I can draw simply. I serve the ideas that pop into my head, but I know that that's not the quote unquote magic of it. The magic of it is the simplicity and the blunt truth. If you consider like even comedians, Lenny Bruce, for example, he got in trouble for just speaking the blunt, honest truth in front, saying private thoughts in a public space.
Mhm. Mhm.
And people are like, wow, you are so inventive. But again, It resonates here. Same thing with jazz. Coltrane was just like he was all over the place. Those bebop guys zigzagging all over the place, improvising in these moments, creating these organic forms of communication. And it resonated and became the most moving form of art to so many people because it asked for their participation with a language that they already understood. You don't need to be taught. You can sit back and it's an intrinsic understanding.
Mm.
So if you can get somebody to be sparked by the intrinsic commonality that we all share using all these different kinds of art forms, uh, that's the job. Doesn't pay great, but it's not supposed to, you know?
Maybe
No.
the pay is in the outcome. Maybe the pay is in the impact. Maybe the pay is in the clarification that you create in the mind of the observer, the recipient of the piece of art. I mean, the creation of the permission structure becomes a lightning rod, a clarifying mirror that gets held up to society itself, where your pieces, especially for me, and maybe I just resonate with you, but for me, just clarifies so many things. It's like that right there, that piece that you made today, bang. It's like, I get it. I can share it. I can become part of it through the work that you've done. And I think I'm wondering how you see the role of the artist in terms of being the cultural, I don't know, liberator, translator, instigator, the holder of the flame, etc.,
Yeah.
and holding that mirror up to the public. What do you see the artist's role in that, and how do we get to participate in that? And how do activists get to participate in that and further
I,
that?
I think it's the same job. I think that I think the crossover between what a straight activist does and an artist does um, is demonstrate that radical humanitarianism can be applied in everyday life
Hmm.
in the most simplistic way. Because quite often people are discouraged from entering into political conversations because there are so many people who try to make it a club of insufferable know-it-alls who try to demonstrate their wisdom with historical facts
Hmm.
quite often, right? And it's very hard to get into an argument with somebody who starts to pull out, historical truisms that you can't verify
Right.
quickly enough to engage in the political conversation that they want to have with you. Um, when it comes to activism and it comes to art, it's very easy to understand how hierarchy works. It's not that difficult. And if you can make that kind of discourse feel safe in people's mouths, then they will participate, right? Because the people only want to engage with the truth if they see a practical application for the truth after they engage with it, right? So if you can talk about climate change, right? All right, so let's expand our understanding, our definition of what violence is.
Mhm.
Okay, so you start having this conversation, and then you engage with people about what kind of work do you do? You can ask them. Oh, I do the like. Did you have to sign an NDA when you joined your corporate job? What is an NDA? Oh, there's going to be criminality happening that you have to keep your mouth shut about. Oh, all right. So all of a sudden you can go down these places where you're getting rewarded, but your participation is creating a great deal of violence that you're being shielded from. Right. So then you can have that conversation where it's just like you don't need to make $1 million to have a happy life. There is something else that you should be doing. You should be maintaining a white-knuckled grip on your soul, recognizing that other people are going to suffer with your acquiescence to the hierarchical structure, and you're going to keep you're going to see to it that people are going to have their head under a boot, that you are part of the weight that is crushing their head, right? And there's many ways to sort of get into that space. Because in a way you have to trick them in because people can get their dukes up. They can get on guard and they won't listen to you. You can take the approach of like this, is this a question of how human consciousness works? Well, what do you mean? Well, let's consider human consciousness and how it interprets value in the world, right? So you have capital. Capital is an accumulative value system. It goes up and down, right? The less you have, the less value, the more you have. So there's economics, right? A cumulative value system. It determines our ability to feed ourselves, clothe ourselves, have social acceptance, all of the things, basically survival, all determined and relegated by this cumulative value system. What is the value of a human being? That's represented by an intrinsic value system. It goes like this. Matter does this. Trees, organic material, it's like this. It's not like this. This flower is much more important than this flower. No, it's an intrinsic value system. So what happens when you have an intrinsic value system that moves like this, coming in contact with an accumulative value system that goes like this? Now you have a scenario where there will be a circumstance, given how human consciousness works, that will say, I can justify demeaning and not giving a shit about human value because it's going to give me a profit. Bam. So all of a sudden here, and what you see here is what is demonstrated in the real world now. There is no justification for all of the Rust Belt, for example, just across the United States. There's no justification for destroying an ecosystem that is then going to create innumerable cancers in the population and also, tear people's human value down by making them have to be in the lower echelon of the lower class. All of those things. There's no justification for it, but there's justification because we imagine that the accumulative value system of economics has some meaning and some reality to it, and it does not. We're all agreeing that it does, right? A dollar only means something to me if it means something to you, because now I can ask you to do something with it, right? If we can understand the fact that if we can start to agree that that kind of dehumanizing of interaction is possible, maybe we have a hope somewhere down the line of needing to restructure how we deal with ourselves and the planet. Otherwise, it's just going to be too late. And I'm sure that that's so much of what the work that you are engaged in every single day, that great frustration, which gets you to what we were talking about earlier, self-censorship. Because a lot of people know it. They know it's true, but they don't. They've been told that there is, or it's been demonstrated. You don't even have to tell people that if you go against, how things are structured right now, you will be out on the street. Nobody wants discomfort. It's hard enough to get people to go stand in the street with the protests that have been, cultivated now for just like no kings and just people are afraid. They're just not. They're not rehearsed in that kind of activity. So maybe you guys can even talk to me about that a little bit. Like, because I'm curious about how you strategize on a daily basis on trying to get people involved in something that like I said, there's no rehearsal for, and there's this idea that it's not only uncomfortable, but you will be penalized because you see it on the news. Not only just getting hit over the head, but the odd thing is, I mean, the obvious thing is, these white collar jobs, you move up into the, upper middle class and then the sort of the privileged places. Those are the people that have to get involved, just like they had to get involved with breaking apart the segregation in the South. The black population was doing its best as they were getting lynched in talking about what was wrong about the voter suppression and all of that stuff. It only shifted when academics or like some white college students all of a sudden started to fill those spaces, agreed to also get on the buses, to go to the lunch counters, to have their heads bashed in, right? And so that's what my interpretation of what the work that you do, and probably the frustration is getting enough people involved who aren't suffering to recognize the suffering of the people who have no other choice but to suffer.
Mhm. Mhm.
But that is a definite problem. And it's one of the reasons that the climate movement, I think, over the course of the last 10 years, has tried all sorts of different strategies, and none have really worked.
Yeah,
I mean, there isn't really an effective worldwide movement. And part of that, I think, is that as the collapse, which has already begun, progresses, people are having a harder, and I would say at least working class people are having a harder time making ends meet
yeah,
and dealing with daily crisis that, if you tell them this is going to possibly kill your children in 20 years, their response is, well, I got to be able to feed them on Friday.
Right.
And the other factor that's come up, which I think we've touched on a little bit so far today, is this deliberate political and economic and cultural effort to create and sow confusion and lies and day-to-day fake crises that people don't know where to respond.
Yeah.
So, I mean, personally, I find myself saying, I'm going to put my head down and I'm going to focus on this problem and I'm going to look at it more in a spiritual sense
Yeah.
than a day-to-day reward sense. Because if I don't do that, it's pretty depressing. I mean,
Yeah.
it's a tough challenge. I don't know how you feel, J Lo, but I mean,
Yeah,
it's
um, it's very difficult to get someone to consider an idea that causes them to shift their sense of their own identity and reality.
Yeah.
And for example, one of the things I saw today when I was going for a walk, I was listening to some stuff, and there was a woman who was all about the alligator Alcatraz. She's so excited to have those people suffer and be in pain and everything else. And that was a video from a couple of days ago. Then she has family that are directly impacted by the floods in Texas. And she's begging for empathy and care and consideration, and everything else. You're like, what the F? You know,
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
mean,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
so this is the predicament that we find ourselves in, is to how to wake people up to the suffering of each other
Yeah.
and to abandon privilege, which is just a lie to begin with. Now, I don't mean it's a lie that doesn't happen. I mean, it's a lie that that anyone is better than anybody else,
Right.
right?
Right.
Everybody that hears this will die someday. Everybody's going to suffer in their own way. And collectively, we're all suffering. It's just that some people say, well, it's not happening to me yet. You see, all the zone is flooded in the news. How do we get people to do that? And I think
Yeah.
artivism and art is a
Yeah.
big part of that.
Yeah. No, 100%. And that goes back to what I was saying about the culture, you know, because at one time, what we're talking about used to be explored in a much more vibrant theater, uh, also a independent press,
Mhm.
the alternative press. uh, all of these things that the small handful of corporate entities that now fund all the dissemination of all the information that comes to us, um, they're not going to help fund the messaging that corporations and the commodification of everything is terrible and needs to be stopped, right? So at one time there were these outlets where you could have these kinds of conversations, and it was in art and it was in music, it was everywhere. So I'm always a big proponent, obviously, because I'm in it, but the arts community for me really needs a real shot in the arm and a lot of support to be the megaphone for this kind of stuff, and to start to take over the discourse, or at least disrupt it sufficiently that people are again asked to participate. Art asks you to participate. Politics does not. It says react, right? Very staccato, very sort of short form. It doesn't ask you to sit in any space and really consider what is the greater good for yourself or for the society or for the planet. I mean, that's the other thing. You just think of all the work that somebody like Gary Snyder did for decades, just talking about is always never talking about countries when you're talking about the environmental impact of human beings living on the planet. It's bigger than that, right? So how the arts tends to engage with these questions, it's not a nationalistic kind of conversation. It's always about the human equation. And inside of that too, remember, we're talking about some heady things. We're talking about some dark things. Uh, Art allows for even making inappropriate jokes about that stuff. It's all about the humor and the seriousness. For me, a measure of how I try to do my work is I try to do it assuming I'm doing it to friends who are going to understand when I'm being ironic, that when they understand it, because quite often I ask my class this all the time. How often have you made a joke that you knew would be is the most inappropriate thing to say in the moment to get a laugh? And every single person has done it. Everybody does it. And the arts community was allowed to do that. Because what that does is it's sort of it's like this it's like a kind of gymnastics that is just like, all right, let's look at this in three dimensions. Let's walk around this. There's no lines that should be preventing you from making any sort of commentary. Yes, if you make a joke that doesn't land, what's on the other side? Maybe a conversation that says, oops, I'm sorry, I'm not an anti-Semite. I'm not a bigot. I'm not these things. I made a bad joke. And to avoid the canceling of that kind of freedom, we should have the freedom, A, to make the mistake, right, of communication, but also hope that we exist in a society where people will give us the grace of forgiving us for making a mistake. What happened to the even just the most basic idea of Jesus, whether you believe that he could read telepathy and fly and he was the Son of God? That's all irrelevant to me. There's this very basic idea of just like, do you have to wait for somebody to ask for forgiveness before you're willing to give it to them? And it's really one of those challenging questions that a lot of people, I'm bringing up with my class again, and we would be talking and this and that. I'm like, well, Trump, for example, can you forgive Trump? And boy, would that cause like a really interesting conversation. Because I would take that step back and be like, okay, let's look at the history. Look at how he was raised. Look at what he had access to. Look at his father. Look at all of these things. And again, I'm not making excuses for Trump. I'm just saying, there's a way that somebody like Kurt Vonnegut dealt with these things. Kurt Vonnegut never had villains in his novels. They were all different levels of ignorance, right?
Mhm.
So operating under a certain kind of ignorance which will make you behave in a monstrous way is the way I want to engage with other people because I don't ever A want to sort of dehumanize somebody to the point where I think they're a monster because A, I don't think it's accurate. And also B, I don't want to then fall into the trap of thinking once the monster is gone, everything will be okay.
Mm.
It's like then you have the scenario of something like George W. Bush. Man, I can't wait for that guy. Oh, look how eloquent, Barack Obama is. And then you have got a year of my liberal friends telling me, that they're forgiving him for his drone program, the secret renditions, and all the shit that he continued. We're just like, yeah, but he's so smart. It's just like sitting in that chair, getting into the White House. It's not a Gandhi position, It's a pre-existing occupation for very reprehensible human beings. you know so again, if we can recognize that we're all sort of participating in this thing and that there is not a single figurehead that once we topple that person everything is going to be okay. Just Trump, for example, he's being enabled by a great vast network of power brokers who are not have nothing to do with elections.
Right.
They're there. So this idea that you're going to be looking at this circus and that you're going to get rid of the bozo that is evil, the evil bozo, it's not going to fix everything. You're going to feel okay about it. And yes, it may deter a certain weaponized arrogance that he is riding on. Uh, but there's very insidious ways that you can continue to ruin people's lives, and unfortunately, that's just been the case. That's why we are where we are.
Well, how did you get to where you are? In the sense of how did you end up being an artist and getting involved politically? You mentioned that you dropped out of college. Was that part of the process? And maybe a necessary part of the process?
It was
I don't
kind of
know.
a part of the process because growing up in with my family never saw titles of even like other family members as being the significant thing. It was never like, you're going to respect me because I'm your mother, anything. We always thought that kind of stuff was funny. You earn the respect and love of people around you. This has nothing to do with any titles or stature of any sort. Um, so I grew up with that. I have a twin sister, and when I was growing up in the 1970s, the feminization of society was well on the way. Black Power was demonstrating itself in the electric company on a Sesame Street, and stuff like. I was just like, wow, my future is looking really great. Even the gay movement was, with the 70s going into the 80s, just like, look at all of this, all these voices that are allowed to participate. And so I was always somebody who was free to communicate, yes, with a lot of inappropriate jokes, but also inside of the inappropriate jokes, you have to know certain aspects on how society works, how the culture functions, and how politics dysfunction, just to be able to build good jokes, you know. And so I just got into the habit of doing that. I was never told anything about like, wow, you are so special because you can draw really well. And so since I never got that, I never had that sort of like anxiety about like being able to draw the horse exactly right. It's like, I think the horse does this. Well, let me see if it does this. Well, let me see if it does this. So when you have that sort of a freedom,
Right.
you're going to explore so many things and you're going to want to throw yourself. I surprise myself constantly with the work that I do. I never know how it's going to end up. And I just want to see how it's going to end up. So when I went to college, I was an art student at Mason Gross, the fine art school inside Rutgers. It was horribly distracting because my craftsmanship got me A pluses in everything that I handed in, and I wasn't learning anything. And then I started to realize it's like, oh, we only learn what we teach ourselves. Right. So I just started to go to New York and go to and just all these things and just read voraciously and just like really, 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 really work at it. And then college just became a distraction because I would get these assignments just to test the professors. I would get a prompt and I would deliberately go do nothing that the prompt asked me to do. And I would just do something really craftsmanship was A plus. I'm like, what am I doing? Why am I here? Because if they don't even know what to teach me. They don't know what to say to me. So it was a great liberating thing because then for the next 4 years, I just lived on people's floors. I had student loans that I didn't repay, and I used them to buy bootleg records and trap, and just be that kind of a fun-loving, outlaw, you know, dropout.
Yeah.
Um, and I've just been doing that ever since.
Frank?
Yes, well, I have you might call it a personal question or a spiritual question because you've encountered some challenges along the way and maybe some hardships. And I'm wondering if you've had any bouts of cynicism or depression along the way that have held you back. And if you have, how do you deal with that?
I have not. The closest I've ever gotten to depression, which I don't think I've ever had. I mean, I literally, and this might be something that is actually wrong with me, according to my conversations with other people. I wake up every day with a great deal of optimism, I can't wait to wake up every morning. I woke up at 3:40 this morning because I was just like thinking of things that I wanted to do. Um, but the sorrow, if I've had sorrow, it's when I had other people in my life who then I felt like my work might victimize them,
Mhm, mhm.
like with my wife, and then when I had kids,
Mm.
and this idea of just like, wow, I'm being now persecuted, and it's might be hard for me to make some money to feed my children, I don't know if I would call that a depression. It becomes a version of woe, um, but it never has distracted me. It's never had me surrender to the demands of a structure that tells me to get a regular job, keep my mouth shut, do all those things. I've just been lucky enough that I've been rewarded by not compromising.
Nice, nice.
Yeah.
And what about cynicism? I mean, looking at the wicked power imbalance and the difficulty there is to move the needle on the world, do you
Yeah.
ever feel yourself becoming cynical about things?
Maybe momentarily to serve a piece of art that I want to share with people because I recognize cynicism exists in the world, and I really do want to communicate with other people using the language that they also understand. if that makes any sense. Like if I'll produce something that is cynical, but I produce a lot. So if you're following my stuff, you'll see me serving the outrage of the moment, right? And maybe it doesn't consider certain things, you know. And I will do what I was just saying we shouldn't always do, which is I'll have Trump eating a piece of shit or something because emotionally it's just like this is what this feels like, right?
Mhm.
And then you can have something and but as a technique, then people will push back and say that's obscene. You know, I don't want to see him eating shit. Then I get to say, well, this is what he's doing, which is actually worse than shit. This should be much more obscene than him eating shit. All right, don't look at this, but look at this other stuff and do something about this. Right. And I know that you mentioned the word spirituality. I'm a huge fan of Alan Watts. I'm a huge fan of Buddhism and Zen and those kinds of explorations and absurdism, you know, from Camus and so forth. Beckett is one of my favorite people. You know, taking that approach of you know, Maya, if you know what that is. It's just this there's almost like a hoax. There's a theater going on that can make us cynical, that can make us believe that there is good and evil in the world, that says we have an ego that we have to protect and be offended if somebody, you know, says something that contrary to our self-image of, you know, of who we want to be, all that kind of stuff. Those are all noises and distractions. So I often use the lectures of Alan Watts. I bike to them. I'll take a long bike ride, and I have many of his lectures that I can just listen to. And it's just very it's centering. You know, begin the day with a cosmic shrug. What can I do? I don't know what I can do. And then you serve the moment that you're in because that I can handle. When I see suffering and I hear suffering, I know how to engage with that in the moment. And the moment is all we have, you know, and so much of Buddhism and so much of Zen is about that. You know, everything else is a hoax that surrounds the moment that you're in.
Mhm.
Beautiful, beautiful.
So what's in the near future for you? We see you're moving out of your office.
Yeah.
Will there be new ways where people can follow your work and communicate with you?
Yes.
What
Yeah.
plans do you have?
My plans are I was just in Europe. I'm investigating a potential move out of the country if things get really, really bad because I have been targeted in the last couple of years. There's people in the federal government that have named me as a dangerous personality, and so when that starts to happen, you do need an escape plan. So my wife is getting Spanish citizenship. I'm looking into different opportunities just as an artist. I mean, unfortunately, as the work that I do, I could probably ask for, you know, political asylum without waiting for um, you know, citizenship. So in the meantime, I'm now just sinking back into the place where I'm most comfortable and what I was doing before I was a professor for 11 years, which is just amping up the artwork. I have a novel that's almost finished. I have a graphic novel that is finished. I just have to draw it. Plays, all these different forms of writing, journalism, I'm going to start doing again. And I'm just going to be doing art. So the new platform for that obviously is I have a Patreon for the artwork. So trying to get the support of people who like to see this kind of activism slash artwork in society. Will pay for it there. And I just started a Substack, which is called the Independent Ink. And I've been doing it now for about a month and a half, maybe 2 months. And so I'll be doing that. And then of course there's my website clowncrack.com. And yeah, I'm just going to keep turning up the volume on what I'm doing because the times demand it and demonstrating this kind of what other people would call bravery, I would just call it practicality, is the only thing that's going to get other people to do like-minded things. And it's the only thing that is actually going to save us. And I do desperately want to save us.
Frank, do you have anything you want to add?
No, that's a great wrap right there. Yes, I really have enjoyed this conversation, and I look forward to staying in touch because we we need this kind of voice in the world. So I
Yeah,
appreciate it.
anything I can do.
Yeah.
We sure do. I really appreciate it. Halo, do you have anything you want to say?
Thank you. Thank you. I mean, your artwork is a lifeline for my spirit and my sanity. So thank you.
I really appreciate it. Thanks. Yeah,
Yeah.
let's keep doing the good fight. We're in it together.